My name is Gary Allen. I'm the president of the Maryland Forestry Foundation. I want to welcome all of you to this edition of Framing the Future, a webinar series in which we try to look at the issues which will shape the future of forestry in Maryland and attend to the issues which will shape that discussion in the year ahead. The session is being recorded and will be available on our website, marylandforestryfoundation.org, in approximately the coming week. You might note over my shoulder there, for those of you who look closely, you'll see a few snowflakes. I'm not in Washington or Annapolis or Maryland. I'm in Chicago at the National Forestry Partners Conference with nearly 1,000 other delegates here talking about urban and community forestry. We're very pleased that two of our Merrill Fellows, like Megan, are here with us. It's my pleasure today to introduce Megan Carr, who was our very first Merrill Fellow. Megan is a urban forester for the city of Baltimore, Maryland, and she's the moderator for this series. Again, I want to welcome all of you and turn it to Megan for our panel today and the really excellent discussion we have ahead. Thank you, Megan.
Great. Thank you, Gary. A few quick housekeeping notes for those in attendance before we get started. If you have any questions for our speaker today, please enter those into the Q&A box. You can find that at the bottom of your screen. And we have time set aside at the end of today's session to go over all of your questions. So please do enter those at any time during today's discussion. Otherwise, we will go ahead and dive into our discussion on Aldo Leopold and the development of a land ethic. And we're joined today by Jennifer Sterling. She's a master educator and lifelong environmentalist with a deep connection to the land, grounded in a career dedicated to conservation and environmental ethics. She earned her degree in environmental education and environmental philosophy from The Ohio State University, which launched her journey into the field as a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Forest Service in the Pacific Northwest. While she was there, she tracked wildlife and studied neotropical migratory birds. And this role taught her the importance of observation, ecosystem balance, and community-driven conservation, shaping her understanding of the land ethic. Later, as youth and family program manager at Ulbrich Botanical Gardens in Madison, she developed programs that fostered appreciation for the role of plants in landscapes, prompting her to pursue a master's degree in education and refine her skills in teaching and curriculum development as a public school teacher. Now, as programs manager at the Aldo Leopold Foundation, Jennifer focuses on inspiring others to recognize their place in the natural community and embrace the responsibility of caring for the land that sustains us all. So, very excited for today's discussion. Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, well, thank you. That was wonderful. I think you got the gist. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So hopefully you can all see that just fine. So I really want to thank you for attending this panel and welcoming me to the stage. Like she said, my name is Jennifer Sterling and I work for the Aldo Leopold Foundation. So tonight we're really going to be, or today, we're really going to be exploring Aldo Leopold and his journey to what he calls the land ethic. And it really starts with, and at the heart of his journey is this question of what is our relationship to the land? This is a fundamental question that Leopold grappled with throughout his life, and it shaped his journey. And throughout his life, he would answer this in a variety of different ways. And one of the things that I think is profound about this particular aspect of Leopold is that it gives us this model of personal and then social evolution, and that this flexibility to change and grow as we come to understand ourselves and the land better. I also like to start with just saying, like, why does it matter? We're looking at Leopold. He's an old figure. If you're not sure about him, we're gonna do a little bit of historical relevance and who he was, but his ideas really aren't just historical. They're very relevant for today, because really what he's doing is he's calling for us to redefine our relationship to the land. And this entreaty has only grown with more urgency in modern times as we face critical environmental challenges. So in this presentation today, I really want to explore how Leopold how his experiences and his reflections on those experiences led to this revolutionary philosophy, which he called the land ethic. So we'll look at his journey a little bit. We want to also delve into be thinking about how his journey is this template for us as modern people moving through developing our own relationship with the land, both as individuals, and then I believe many of us are probably conservation specialists, and how it affects us and the work that we do. but then also not just our own internal evolution, but a societal evolution as well. So with that, I will start with just a little bit of an explanation about who we are as the foundation. So the foundation itself is located in Baraboo, Wisconsin, was founded in 1982 by Aldo Leopold's 5 children, and it's dedicated to advancing this idea of a land ethic, which Leopold championed, and which we'll be talking about it in depth today. So our mission is to inspire individuals and communities to develop a ecological conscience, which is really this idea of a moral relationship with the land that's rooted in stewardship and ethical decision making. The primary work that we do here is one of it is conservation and restoration. So we actually own 4,000 acres of land, part of which is the shack and farm, the original shack and farm that Aldo Leopold owned. And we act as a living model of ecological restoration on that land, returning it to its pre-colonization ecosystems, which is predominantly tall grass prairie lands. We also do environmental education, predominantly with adults or young college-age students that are looking at careers in environmental studies. We have monthly virtual programs similar to this, where we invite guests on to talk about a variety of topics, looking at conservation leaders. We do tours, presentations, a variety of diverse programming in that way. We also have a fellowship program where we have 5 fellows a year that we train to be conservation leaders. So that's just a little bit about the foundation itself. We've been around, like I said, since 1982, and we really are working to develop a national movement in the land ethic and really helping to shift the paradigm that our society, the way our society sees our relationship to the earth. So who was Leopold? Well, Leopold himself was a pioneering conservationist and visionary. He lived from 1887 to 1948. He's considered one of the most influential conservationist environmental philosophers of the 20th century. So his roles included he was a forester, he was a scientist, he actually created the field of wildlife management before it even existed, so he's considered the father of that. He was one of the first ecological thinkers. So in his time, ecology was not a science, and he was one of the first to make this cognitive leap and really understand relationships. He also is the founder of restoration ecology and putting his ideas to practice on the land. He was the first professor in the United States, and we believe in the world, to teach wildlife management, and he did that at the University of Wisconsin. And then what most people know him as the author of a Sand County Almanac, which is his seminal book that he wrote. And he wrote that throughout his life. It's a collection of essays that he wrote throughout his life and then was actually published posthumously. But some people consider him also a prophet for his forward-thinking ideas. He was beyond his actual roles that paid money. He was a philosopher. He was a visionary. He was a policymaker. And so his journey really throughout his life is he develops this idea of a land ethic, which I said we'll talk a lot about. But in a nutshell, he really expands our vision of how we relate to the land. And we're going to talk about what his roots were and how he made those changes. So one of the things that I think is really important is understanding the context and the time in which he lived. So he was born in the horse and buggy era, and he died in the nuclear era. So if you can just that visual in and of itself really says a lot, right? Like he lived through incredibly transformative period of time. And not only did that arc of history wasn't very transformative, he helped to shape that arc of history. And it's important to realize that when he was born, the United States only had 38 states. So he lived through a time of rapid growth. And in that time during his life, the United States the citizens moved from being more rural to being more than 50% being urban within his lifetime. Some other huge events happened. There were 2 world wars during his lifetime, which really brings into point comes to a head when the wars had a huge ecological implications on the resources that were needed, but also these ideas of what is freedom and what does it mean to be a citizen. During this time, also the growth of automobiles becomes a thing and tourism. And so roads are being built in areas and people are traveling and exploring the world and the United States in more diverse ways. But also the Great Depression happened where economic realities really set in for the society. Another critical event was the Dust Bowl happened during this time. So looking back, the Dust Bowl was really critical in soil conservation, but also not just soil conservation, but also just our recognition of our impacts and the impacts that we have on the earth and how it really affects us as humans. Another big event that happened was in 1920, women got the right to vote. So when he was born, they didn't have the right to vote. So that's huge because his wife's half sister, it was very instrumental in the civil rights movement. She's actually on the quarter in New Mexico. Her name is Nina Otero Warren. And so you have to wonder, how did that help him frame his ideas about who is a citizen, who has a voice? So all these things that happened during his lifetime really helped to shape his experiences and his thinking. And I don't think we can separate him from the context, just like we can't separate any of us from the context with which we live. The other thing that's really important that I like to point out at this point is that he lived through immense challenges. So 2 world wars, the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression. And to me, this gives me a sense of hope that humanity was capable of overcoming and adapting to these adversities. And it gives me this sense of hope that perhaps we can too with the environmental challenges that we face today. One of the ways that he helped shape the arc of history is through this concept of ecology. Now, I'm sure most of us here have a basic understanding of what ecology is, if not an in-depth one. The thing that I think is really interesting is that when Leopold was born and throughout most of his life, ecology was not a science. It wasn't something that was recognized. There was not this vision of the world in relationship. And one of the biggest things that one of the biggest contributions that Leopold makes into the world at this time is that he's one of the first people to have this, to really grasp, to really imagine and articulate ecology as the science of relationships and community. And he tirelessly shared this passion and this vision with people that just didn't see it yet. So he's offering a new lens in which to see the world. I wouldn't say that we have completely adopted the ecological worldview yet, but when he was born, the understanding was really reductionist. Reductionism was the main way of seeing the world. It was very human-centered. It was saying, let's look at the individual. And by understanding the individual, we can understand the whole system, which really led then to a utilitarian view of the world, which then led to this human-centric economic view of the world. There are some ways in which reductionism can be good science, but in terms of systems thinking and thinking long-term and sustainability, it really lacks. And so this ecological consciousness, this ecological worldview that Leopold spurs or helps to spur into the world, gives us this new lens of looking at the world as a complex web of relationships where every organism and every process plays a vital role. This is counter to what the world view in Western European and American culture was at that time. I want to stress that there were other peoples that hold an ecological worldview, but at the time in Western white American culture, it was not seen that way. So he really helped to shift that and bend the arc in that way. And he laid the foundation for the modern conservation and environmental ethic movements. So just to look back a little bit, the Sand County Almanac is a seminal work. It's an important book that was published in 1949. Like I said, it was published posthumously, and he had worked to get it published. It's a series of 41 essays. It's broken into 3 separate sections. The 3 sections mirror the different aspects of parts of his life. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this is he worked hard to get it published and received a lot of rejections, and some kind of brutal ones. And that's a theme that will come up. I'll get it again in his life, is these rejections, but then his resiliency to continue going and doing the right thing or moving forward regardless, maybe making adjustments with his thinking or what he's doing, and then moving forward and just not giving up. I think that's a good theme that we can take from Leopold's life. In April 14th, in 1948, he did finally receive a letter of acceptance from the Oxford University Press. And then 1 week later, on April 21st, 1948, he passed away of a heart attack while he was fighting a grass fire that had got out of control on his neighbor's property here in Wisconsin. So his children were really instrumental in making sure that that book got published. After it got published, it had, mediocre reviews, and not so much reviews. It was a tight circle of people that were interested in it. It wasn't a big, expansive. People weren't clamoring to purchase it. However, in the 1970s, with the Earth Day, the first Earth Day, and Rachel Carson, it really skyrocketed. It has been in print since that time. And it has been translated into 16 different languages. It's used as a textbook example of American writing in China for, like, I think all 8th grade students read at least part of it. But just really quick to give you, if you haven't read it, I highly suggest. It's an easy one to pick up. You can read just snippets of it and not have to read it all in one shot, although his writing is exquisite. So the first section is called the Sand County Almanac, and these are based off the early years of his life where he was this young child and really enjoyed nature. The writings are monthly observations about nature that really set this broader environmental framework for this broader environmental philosophy by just celebrating the intimate details of the natural world. And these resonate with the time that he spent as a child, out as a nature enthusiast. He loved nature deeply, was a bird watcher, hunter, fisher. The second part of the book is called Sketches Here to There. These correlate more with the middle years of his life. Now he moves out beyond Wisconsin, and he starts having these writing about these pivotal moments in his life as a professional forester. These essays highlight the transformative experiences that he had, and he's deepening understanding of conservation and humans' interactions with the earth, and it starts shaping his environmental ethical philosophy. And then the last section of the book is called The Upshot. And these really correlate to the final years of his life where he's a professor and a philosopher. And this is where he lays out the land ethic, where he lays out his philosophical ideas and his key message that we have a responsibility to the biotic community, that we are members of it, and that we have this responsibility and obligation and stewardship to the land. I would say that this is still relevant today. Many people continue to read his book and be inspired. I would highly recommend it if you haven't read it. So we're going to kind of look at the different phases of his life as quickly as possible to kind of give you some ideas of how he grew into the land ethic. And then we'll talk about what the land ethic really is, and we'll be interspersing that throughout. So basically, he had a really natural childhood. He grew up in Iowa. His family was with a family of outdoors people, so he spent a lot of time outside. He would study and explore nature. His mother, so the picture on the left is with his grandfather. The picture in the middle is his mother, Clara, and she really cultivated this understanding of literature and culture, and especially writing, which you could come to see when you read his writing. He's a very, very well-written author. And then his father, Carl Leopold, also instilled in him some really interesting ideas about the natural world. And so he was really into hunting. And Leopold himself, Aldo Leopold, would be into hunting throughout his entire life as well. But the thing that's unique, and when we start to see as foundational for Leopold himself, is that his father, Carl, had these rules around hunting, and they really were ethics. So, for example, you never loaded a gun before sunrise. You always had a double barrel, so you had a second shot in case you only wounded an animal. He refused to hunt species whose numbers were declining. He refused to hunt species in the spring. He did not believe in using live or feed or live baits, but decoys were okay. So what we see here is that Carl had this code of honor around hunting at a time when there was no legislation. Okay, he just had this innate understanding that hunting was not just a right, but it was also implied that there was a responsibility and an obligation behind that. And that even if the law is not telling you to do something, that you still do what is right based off of this moral compass, this moral understandings. And so we start to see these foundations in Leopold while he's thinking about our relationship to the natural world in an ethical framework. Where he lived and where he grew up as a child is also really important. He was born in Iowa, and Iowa was considered the wild frontier sort of at that time. But significantly, and most importantly, he was born on the Mississippi River. And what's really important about this, and there's multiple reasons, but the Leopold family made their money off of a company called the Leopold Desks, which, if you can imagine, is made from wood. So there's two really significant things about his childhood on the Mississippi River. One is that because their company is based off of wood, his father, Carl Leopold, is really thinking of noticing the wood that's coming down the Mississippi River. So basically what's happening is timber companies are cutting the wood up north in Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and then they're sending it down the Mississippi River in these big, huge rafts, right? And so by the turn of the 20th century, they're starting to notice that these rafts of logs are dwindling in both size and frequency. So essentially, the old growth white pine forest of the Great Lakes and the eastern seaboards are just being reduced to stubble. And Carl's recognizing this, and he's recognizing this depletion, and he's making this connection to long-term sustainability long before there's even any thought about long-term sustainability at all. His company relies on wood, yet despite that, he's recognizing that beyond immediate profits, he's considering, well, what's going to happen in the West when these timber barons move out West? It's going to be the same thing. So unless the public steps up and says something, we're going to run out of trees. This isn't long-term sustainability going on here. Again, this is a time before this is even considered. This is not a thing. People are not thinking about sustainability. And he shares these ideas with his son, who he spends a lot of time outside with. And so we start to see that he's shaping the understanding of Leopold in the context of this need for some kind of stewardship of the land. Alongside with the declining forest, Carl's noticing, and Aldo himself are noticing, the dwindling waterfowl on the Mississippi Flyway. So again, they're avid hunters, and they're noticing that the populations are just starting to become diminished. What resources they once thought were just inexhaustible are starting to decline. I will mention at the same time, this is when passenger pigeons are becoming extinct or become extinct. The last one in the wild was in 1900. The one in captivity, the final one to die in captivity, was 1914. So Leopold himself, Aldo, would never have seen a wild passenger pigeon. But this idea of this resource that was once so abundant being completely exterminated is setting root with some people, Carl and Aldo, for example. So there was some laws that were instituted, like in the early 1900s. And Leopold hears of, in the spring of 1904, he hears about these hunters that have gone out and they break the laws and they kill 150 ducks apiece in the season. And what Aldo does is he writes to his father. He's away at school at the time. And he writes to his father and he says, "When my time comes, I am sure nothing in my power will be lacking the good cause." So that's paraphrased to make it shorter, but what he's doing is he's marking a commitment to this personal responsibility. He's pledging to protect wildlife and the game that he cherished so much. So he's seeing this as this personal call to action for himself, and based off of people not doing the right thing, and he's going to do what he can. So he makes this comment to his father in a letter that he wrote. And it really represents his first steps towards understanding conservation as a personal responsibility, and then the recognition of our obligation to safeguard resources and the wildlife that sustain us all. Now, in the world at this time, you may recognize these two people. There's things happening. There's this inherent, and there's this tension between competing worldviews about what to do with the natural resources that are part of the United States. So on the left, we have John Muir. On the right, we had Gifford Pinchot. Leopold would spend most of his life trying to reconcile these tensions. The two influential voices that really emerged then was John Muir on the left. He's a preservationist. And so he's advocating passionately for preserving wildlife for its inherent value beyond human use. He's instrumental in saying that there's areas and landscapes that need to just be left alone. They should be untouched. And he's instrumental in the National Park Service getting established. The other side of the coin is Gifford Pinchot, and he's a utilitarian conservationist. So his thinking is more, everything on the land is a resource. It is for us to use. We should use it wisely, but wisely meant to him that we would be able to have the greatest good for the greatest number of people for the longest time we can. So his perspective really prioritized natural resource management, and but not so much sustainability, but management. Not sustainability in the way we understand it today, over preservation. And he really saw nature as a product that we should just that we should be able to extract. He didn't see any intrinsic value whatsoever. So the division between the preservation and utilitarian conservation really had a huge impact on conservation policy and practice throughout the early 20th century. I will say that Pinchot's family was well off. They gave Yale University money to start the Yale School of Forestry, which was a master's program. And then in 1905, and that was in 1900. And then in 1905, the U.S. Teddy Roosevelt established the U.S. Forest Service, and Gifford Pinchot is made the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service. So you can imagine then what's happening is people are funneling through the Yale School of Forestry to become foresters, and then they're going on to the Forest Service, and it all ends up being steeped really in this idea of this resource, that the natural world is a resource. It's really focusing on Pinchot's ideas about that the earth is there for us to extract from. So Leopold does what anybody does at that time that wanted to go into forestry. He went on to the Yale School of Forestry. He's 1905, he's 18 years old when he goes. He graduates in 1909 at 22 years old. He's in the left here on this picture. He's the one in the light suit. And I like to show this picture because it shows, it's symbolic of his willingness to stand out and be different. And I think that kind of shows symbolically how different he was and still remains. So during his time, of course, he was aware of both worldviews, but for the time being, he's buying Pinchot's program. And then he graduates. He's in the 5th graduating class of the Yale Forestry School. And he says, I want to go to the most wild place you can send me. So the Forest Service sends him off to the Arizona Territory. So now, just as a point of context, in 1912, New Mexico and Arizona are not states yet. This is the wild frontier. So he's going out to this wild place. You can see the picture on his left, or on the right, sorry, it looks very much like he is in the Wild West. His first job duty, though, is as a timber surveyor, and his job is to preserve a perpetual supply of timber for home industries. I mean, in a nutshell, that's what he's setting off to do. So he does this. He heads to the the Southwest, and he would spend until 1924 down in the Southwest. And some influential experiences happen while he's down there, and we'll talk about those. But in a nutshell, he gets married. He starts a family. His marriage to Estella Bergier is really, we could have a whole other conversation about that. The cultural influences, obviously, his sister-in-law then was a suffragette, so the concepts of who gets a voice in our society, I think, plays a big role in his thinking about who gets a voice in decisions that we make on the land. But throughout his career, he would have ups and downs. He would have good moments and bad moments. But ultimately, he's like 24 years old, and he becomes the deputy supervisor for the Carson National Forest, which, having worked for the Forest Service, I can say that's a huge job for somebody so young. So he's overseeing, millions of acres of land. And this has a huge impact on him, not only overseeing the land, but making decisions about managing timber, the grazing permits, range conservation, working with local ranchers and local families. And these all begin to shape his ideas of conservation. And so some of the things that we see happening, some of the big connections that I want to point out, there's many that I could talk about, but for brevity's sake, one big thing that happens is he sees true wilderness for the first time. So he writes in one of his essays in a Sand County Almanac is called The Song of the Gavilan. And he goes on this trip and he goes into the wilderness. And he's into Mexico. And this is what he says. He says, "It was here that I first clearly realized that land is an organism, that all my life I had seen only sick land, whereas here was a biota still in perfect aboriginal health. The term unspoiled wilderness took on a new meaning." And I think what's also significant about this is that this was not an unpeopled land. The indigenous people who had lived there for millennia still lived on that land, and it still was this beautiful, healthy ecosystem. And he's starting to make these connections. He's making these connections between how people are interacting with the land in good ways and in positive ways, or ways that promote health and ways that don't. And so then when he's back on the lands that he is overseeing, he's starting to notice some things. Okay, so he's noticing, you can see the huge juxtaposition between this true wilderness and the on land. He's noticing the impacts of logging and overgrazing of public lands. In fact, while he was there, 90% of the topsoil had been washed off of the land along the Blue River in the Apache National Forest that had been pristine when he first arrived. Also, there was wildlife extirpation. All wildlife pretty much was gone. They would go days and not see turkey or deer. We think about it now. I know in Wisconsin, like, I have to worry about driving home at night. What animal am I going to hit? Because they're everywhere. This was not the case. They had been completely extirpated from the area, almost completely, because of the impacts that humans were having on Western culture humans were having on the land. And so it's really novel and extremely visionary that he starts to make this connection. He makes this cognitive leap as something that's a signature move of Leopold's legacy. And he starts to see this impact. He's recognizing and connecting these dots, and he's seeing that what's happened on the land is not an act of God. He's saying that they were results, they were the causes, they were the effects that could be traced to human decisions. And so this is really instrumental in his thinking. One other thing that was happening at that time was there was big social change. So of course there was the First World War had happened, and after the war had happened, freedom was really talked about, citizenship was talked about, what it meant, this American pride, which is all fabulous stuff. But when you start thinking about freedom and you tie automobiles in there and building roads, all of a sudden the landscape starts to change for another reason too. Roads are coming into these pristine areas. So around the Grand Canyon, which is one of the areas that Leopold toured at the time and was in charge of overseeing, he'd go down there and these beautiful areas that we think of now, but they had electric signs jutting out of them. There was sewage everywhere. There was vendors trumpeting their wares. There was garbage everywhere. And he thought, oh my gosh, something has to be done about this. We can't continue this. So he's recognizing and he's seeing these social changes, and he's seeing these decisions that humans are making in our culture, in American culture, and he's saying, wow, there are other decisions we could be making that wouldn't have this negative impact on the land, and what are we going to do about it? So he's only 28 years old, and he writes this memo to the Forest Service, and this is one of the things that I think is really significant. So he started off as a Forest Service saying, my job is to protect trees so that we can, not so much protect them, but maintain a never-ending supply of trees. And so that's what the Forest Service policy was. And now he's starting to expand this definition of community, of definition of responsibility, the circles of responsibility. And he puts forth to the Forest Service, he says, we should start considering game species as forest products, and then we should manage them for this wild species for count and quality. And this is really significant because at this point, nobody's thinking about game in terms of a resource, in terms of managing. Nobody's managed wildlife before. He's asking the Forest Service to expand its definition of responsibilities. Now, the thing that's really also interesting about this is the Forest Service resoundingly says no to him. He gets a rejection. Again, a theme in his life. He puts forth something, he gets a rejection, but he doesn't stop. He continues to move. He doesn't, he refines his ideas, but he doesn't give up. I also want to notice here that he's only talking about game animals. He's not expanded his circle of care right now or community to predators. So we're seeing this expansion of community, but it's not moving from trees to game species, but not fully into an ecological consciousness yet. One of the other things that he does while he's down there and right before he leaves is wilderness is not a thing either, right? So the Forest Service is built on getting trees. And he's noticing all these things that are happening, saying, gosh, if we don't preserve some areas, and he doesn't trust the Park Service to do that. So he proposes something else to the Forest Service, which is also the antithesis of Picot's wise use. He's offering this philosophical shift, and he's saying, he's recommending that the service expand its definition again, and includes from timber to game to recreation or wilderness areas. And so he defines wilderness as a continuous stretch of country preserved in its natural state, open to lawful hunting and fishing, big enough to absorb a 2 weeks pack trip, and kept devoid of roads, artificial trails, cottages, and other works of man. What's cool about this is this one actually receives positive news, and the Forest Service establishes the Gila Wilderness Area in New Mexico in 1924. So that was 100 years ago this past June. And it was the first such wilderness area in the world, I believe, but definitely in the United States. And it set a foundation, a model for other wilderness areas to be developed or protected within the Forest Service across the United States. So again, these expanding circles of understanding of what are we responsible for, what is in our community of care, from timber to game species to now wilderness lands. So when he's in 1924, he moves back to the Midwest. He gets one job working for the Forest Products Lab. He hates it. It's an office job. It's not what he wants to do. So in the midst of kind of the Great Depression era, he quits that job and he becomes the very first ever wildlife game survey manager. He decides, you know what? I don't see wildlife anymore. Someone needs to go around the Midwest and drive around and do these surveys. So again, it's hard to believe that, white-tailed deer and raccoons had to be reintroduced to the state, but they did, right? At this time, they did not exist for the most part. They were extirpated. They were rare sightings of these types of animals and game species. And so he's wanting to do a survey of that. So he gets contracted work and is able to support himself, and he does these surveys. When he gets done with the surveys, then he goes on to become a professor at the University of Wisconsin, where he teaches wildlife management. So some things that are significant about this era of his life is when he comes to the Midwest, first thing he notices is this thing called clean farming. And it's basically the land devoid of any biological diversity. It's focused purely on agriculture or human development of building roads and towns. So it's draining the wetlands, plowing the fields, getting rid of all the species. And as you can see in this picture on the left, that's the actual picture of the early 1900s. The erosion was significant. But people didn't have those connections yet, right? People didn't understand the connection between plant species, animal species, soils, water. They didn't get these connections yet. The other thing that happens while he's in the Midwest is the Dust Bowl. So if you didn't get it with this clean farming erosion, you certainly got it with the Dust Bowl. It's a critical time in conservation history because now we can't really humans cannot deny their impact of our practices on the land. And this is when soil conservation becomes a thing. And then the other thing that's really interesting about his move to the Midwest is that he goes from an area that there's huge swatches of land that is owned in the public domain and managed by, for example, the Forest Service, to a state and states where most of the land is privately owned. And so you have a very different land management practice because of that. So while he's doing these surveys, what he ends up happening is he has this paradigm shifting realization. And he writes up, after his surveys, he writes up this report. And what he ultimately says is that, we've been trying to preserve animals and game species specifically, but he's starting to expand to other animals. We've been trying to preserve them through hunting regulations or refuges. And the bottom line is, if they don't have a habitat to live in, those things are not going to matter. He's the first one within our culture to recognize, make the connection between habitat and a healthy populations of animals. So this is paradigm shifting. He goes on then to write a book called Game Management. So he is basically writing the textbook for a profession that does not exist yet. And the central thesis of this is that game can be restored. It can be restored by the same tools that we've used to destroy it if we make different decisions. And I think this is really important to understand, that we still have a role to play. It is the decisions and how we use our tools that are ultimately the most important thing. He eventually gets a job with the University of Wisconsin here in Madison. It's the first academic position anywhere devoted to this brand new field that he's written the textbook for and he's developed on wildlife management. This is the seminal text, still in print today. Still has a lot of core values in it that are relevant. The other thing that he did that's really interesting during this time is he buys a chicken coop on the Wisconsin River, which is lovingly called the Shack. He and his family called the Shack. And he, at this point in the later years in his life, he's starting to find a third way beyond these tensions of this preservation versus utilitarianism. He's starting to find this third way of being with the natural world, and it's called restoration. And so he was instrumental in development of restoration ecology as a science. He worked with the University of Wisconsin in an arboretum where they did restoration ecology there. It's actually the first native prairie restoration ecology project in the United States. And then on his property that he bought, he and his family would spend weekends up here restoring it. It was a tired, worn out farm in sandy soils on the Wisconsin River. It basically had been farmed to nothingness, and he works to restore it. Now, he used what he could and what he knew at the time, but he did a phenomenal job, and we're still doing that work today. He planted over 40,000 pine trees, he and his wife and his children, very few of which lived. But just an idea of how he actually started putting his ideas to practice on the land. This here is just a picture of what the shack looks like now. It's considered a National Historic Landmark, a National Historic Building. You can come visit it for tours. There is a virtual tour on our website, but you can see how it's changed. This isn't really completely indicative of the 4,000 acres. Many of the trees were left here because Leopold planted them, but we do have mostly prairie in the in oak savannas in the areas that we're restoring. So just to give you an idea of the restoration work that was done and is still ongoing. So now we're working on this evolution of his, where he's gone from, this utilitarian worldview that's human-centric and that our duty of care is just really self-serving, to he's broadening his ideas of what we really need to be responsible and what our obligations are. So this is one example of that. It demonstrates this evolution that he had. So he wrote an essay called Thinking Like a Mountain. It's in the San County Almanac. It's one of his most famous ones. It is based off of the fact that he shot a wolf. So in 1909, he shoots this wolf. And in 1944, he writes the essay. So what is important here, well, there's many things, but one thing that I want to highlight is that this demonstrates 35 years of growth and evolution. Okay, so it's not like this epiphany overnight. And I think that's important for us to recognize that social evolution and just like personal evolution takes time, and that everything we can do is moving us forward is an important step, even if it doesn't feel so. So the story is he's down in the Southwest. He sees these wolves crossing the river, and he does what any person at that day and age did. They shot them. He and his partner that he was with shot them. So he writes about this experience. We reached the old wolf in time to watch a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. I was young then and full of trigger itch. I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would mean hunter's paradise. But after seeing the green fire die, I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view. So this is showing his evolution is now complete. What was vogue at the time is that you killed all the predators. In fact, policy was you kill all the predators: mountain lions, bears, wolves, bobcats. They were killed. And this evolution in his thinking now is coming full circle. And he's like, no, all aspects of our ecosystems, which wasn't a word yet, but all aspects of the land are important, and they have an important role to play. So we see this culmination of his evolution in his understanding of predators. So just as a graphic to kind of see, we can see that he keeps expanding what he calls community and what we can understand as our biotic community now, and what we are responsible, what we have an obligation to. So it starts with timber, moves to game species, then all species except for predators. He still hasn't included predators. Then he's starting to look at wilderness. And then he's starting to look at the social context and how we are all shaping that for good or not. And then he comes to this final conclusion of the whole concept of the land. And this is where we enter the idea of the land ethic. And this includes predators, it includes all the living and non-living elements, and includes all the human and non-human elements of the land. So what is the land ethic? So the crux of what he finally concluded at the end of his life, what he came to is this idea that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of a biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So ethics in general are the moral principles that guide communities, right? And how to treat each other with respect for the benefit of all, right? So the land ethic, what it does is it expands the idea of community. So it's not just your fellow human beings or the people that you are working with, but it expands that. And he goes on to say, we abuse the land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. He's moving from this model of ownership to membership. Ownership implies control and rights over a resource, where membership implies not just the rights of being a member of a community, but the responsibility that focuses on stewardship instead of exploitation. I think this is one of the key things that we take away from Leopold, and I think is relevant at this time. There's a lot of talk about rights, but there's not as much talk and weight put on the responsibility that comes with being part of a community. And so he's calling us to be better stewards of the land. And he's asking us, what would it look like to live with respect for the land? What would that look like? Instead of considering what is in it for us, we start to think, how do our actions affect the land community? And are those actions preserving the stability, integrity, and beauty of the land? Or are those actions not? Right? How do we show up to our relationship to the land? I think it's not a question of if we show up. The question is, how are we going to show up? Regardless what we want to believe, we are part of an ecosystem. We are reaping the benefits from fresh air and fresh water, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. So how then do we show up to that relationship in a healthy way? Obviously, I think most of us would agree that our relationship with nature is out of balance today. We can see that through climate change, biodiversity loss, habitat destruction. They're just kind of these reminders of what could happen if we don't expand our ethical boundaries and start considering the biotic community. So the land ethic then calls us to challenges us really to take responsibility and make these ethical decisions with foresight and acting for long-term goals instead of short-term. So I've broken the land ethic down into 4 essential tenets. I'm sure that can be done in other ways as well. But one of the first concepts of a land ethic is this basic premise is the understanding of a community and what is the community that we are inherently part of. So a land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively the land. In short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to just plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. So humans are now being called to consider themselves members of the community and not just conquerors of it. This can be difficult to translate into policy. However, it is one of the first steps in really understanding the land ethic. Another main tenet of the land ethic is this concept of intrinsic worth. He says, the last word in ignorance is the man who says of an animal or plant, what good is it? If the land mechanism as a whole is good, then every part is good, whether we understand it or not. If the biota in the course of eons has built something that we like but do not understand, then who but a fool would discard seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. So he's starting to understand biodiversity before biodiversity is even a concept in Western cultures. And he's saying that he's calling for us to recognize the worth of all of the elements in the ecosystems, from the smallest to the largest, and recognizing that they really are all one. I like the concept of like a crane does not live in the marsh. A crane is the marsh. Really understanding that this is a system that is a living thing, and to extract anything from it is to make it less than. So the land ethic really affirms the right, not only the right of the natural world's continued existence, but the necessity by definition. So another part of it is this concept of ecological conscience. So once you can accept that the community is larger and that we're members of a community that is much bigger than just human community, and once you can accept the concept that everything has intrinsic value, not just economic, for maintaining the integrity of that community, then you can start shifting in this ecological consciousness. And the ecological consciousness is really about systems thinking, it's about community thinking, it's about relational thinking. So he says ecology is the science of biotic communities, and the ecological conscience is therefore the ethics of community life. An ecological conscience is an affair of the mind as well as the heart. Right? So again, not are we going to show up, but how are we going to show up? And this understanding that it's not just by laws, but it's something that happens internally. It's this moral compass with which we are guided through life and living on the planet without spoiling it. And then once you have these basic tenets, so you've got the community, you've got the intrinsic value, you've got this ecological conscience, it really isn't a far leap to say, okay, so now what are the human obligations and responsibilities because we are part of this community? And Leopold emphasizes that humans are part of the land community, and so therefore we also bear this unique responsibility to actively care for and maintain the healthy ecosystems. That the duty goes beyond just passive enjoyment or exploitation of natural resources, and really requires stewardship, thoughtful actions, things like that that sustain to sustain future generations. He says there is as yet no ethic dealing with a man's relation to land and to animals and plants which grow upon it. The land relation is still strictly economic, entailing privileges but not obligations. And he says obligations have no meaning without conscience. And the problem we face is the extension of the social conscience from people to the land. I would go on to say one of my favorite quotes from him, and I'm going to probably butcher it. I don't have it written in front of me, but to paraphrase it, he really starts talking about how interesting it is that we have these fields of science that are relegated as separate. So what he's talking about is we have these fields of science like sociology and politics and these human dimensions, and we say those are separate from the sciences of ecology, and that really, once we blend these two and really understand that they are one and the same, that's when we will have this social evolution and really understand this ecological consciousness and our obligations that fall within that. So why do we need a land ethic now more than ever? Well, I mean, I think if we just look around the world today, we can see we have this imbalance in our world, right? We have these challenges that hopefully we can overcome and we can adapt to, but we probably will not be able to overcome them unless we can reshape our beliefs about how we are connected to the land and that we aren't separate from the fate of all the systems that we rely on. In Leopold's time, the idea of ecological interdependence was new, but it's not today, right? It's an undeniable reality today. And really deeply considering this relationship is something that humans are going to have to grapple with, especially in these Western white privileged cultures, not only just for the land health, but for all human health as well. So now that we kind of understand the land ethic, the big question is like, well, what comes next? Like, how do we put this into practice in our daily lives? How can a land ethic guide us into shaping a more responsible, sustainable relationship with the natural world? Well, I think we just need to go back to that basic principle that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity and stability and beauty of a biotic community, and it is wrong when it tends otherwise. Now, I am fully aware that there's interpretation within that. And Leopold knows this. He says a land ethic can never be written. It is evolves in the minds of thinking community. He knows that this is an evolution in progress, right? He's at least laying out some tenets for us to talk about and to be thinking about. But I do think his ideas can serve as a compass for every action, decision, policy that touches the land, whether it's an individual, it's a community, or at a national level. So it really, though, it's not comfortable to always be adopting this principle and thinking about the immediate outcomes versus their broader implications and long-term impacts on ecosystems and future generations, especially in a culture that wants immediate results, and not, it's not economically viable always to have these long-term thinking. However, there are examples of societies doing this, and in the way that they are zoning their cities or the way that they are making decisions on the land. And I will give a case example at the end here. Leopold did say, we shall never achieve harmony with land any more than we shall achieve absolute justice or liberty for people. In these higher aspirations, the important thing is not to achieve, but to strive. And I would say, yes, we need to keep acting, even if we aren't 100% sure of our actions. But the point is that we're continually trying and evolving. It's not about perfection. It's about committing to this ongoing improvement in how we interact with the land. And that really understanding that our actions do have an impact and that they are an opportunity for us to create harmony, even if we don't ever reach the endpoint within our lifetimes, right? We have this opportunity. It can look a lot of different ways. On an individual level, it can be small actions, that we probably know all of them, like conserving water, reducing waste, choosing sustainably sourced products, things like that. Community level, we can start thinking about ways that they're incorporating the principles like native plant restoration, protecting local watershed, preserving open spaces, the zoning and development regulations. businesses, if they could adopt ecological thinking, they could really have a big impact on how that would be, how they would be impacting or degrading or not the planet, reducing their carbon footprints, choosing different products to make their products out of, different materials to make their products out of. And obviously policy, big policy measures are always helpful in making a bigger impact, like the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, Migratory Bird Act. Those have huge implications at a bigger level. But I think my point is that at any level, there's the actions that can be taken, and none of them should be taken lightly. So beyond the basic policies and initiatives, fostering a land ethic, I really think education plays a key role. I might be a little biased as an educator myself, but I do think not just education, but this connection with the land. It's really hard to care about something that you're not connected to. And so I think education and teaching younger generations the value and respect of the land, and I would say not just younger generations, but also I don't limit education to just young people. I think there's formative years that it's really important, but I also think that any program that can help any human at any age develop and be thinking about their relationship to the land in a meaningful way and have community or have experiences within the land are helpful, right? In the sum, the land ethic has the power to shape individual choices if we put it to practice. I feel like humans are both our greatest source of problems on the earth, but also our source of greatest hope, right? And so the question is, how are we going to show up to that relationship? And is it going to be healthy? Are we our greatest threat? Are we going to be the hope that we all need? So I wanted to end here with just an example of an ethical decision that is working in that we're working on right now in Wisconsin. So just a little background: sandhill cranes are the greater sandhill crane is a species that lives in Wisconsin. It migrates through here, but it does spend its summer months here. In fact, it spends most of its life here anymore with some of the climate changes. But at one point, it was nearly extirpated from the state, and it made this remarkable recovery due to the Migratory Bird Act. And so the reason why it was mostly extirpated was really because of hunting. That was what caused it was overhunted, essentially. So because it's this conservation success story, in fact, when Leopold was alive, he wrote it's called Marshland Elegy, which is essentially the eulogy to cranes, because he thought for sure they would be completely extirpated, if not become extinct. So he thinks they're going to disappear. There was like 12 in the state of Wisconsin at that time, and now we have 100,000 or whatever. So it started this debate. People want to hunt them now. Again, there's this call to open a sandhill crane season in the fall. So ethical decisions, what do we have to do? So first of all, we just define what the question is. Hunting, opening a sandhill crane hunt, is this the right thing to do? And we ask the question, right? And define it. And then we engage the stakeholders. Now, humans are really, really good at engaging certain stakeholders. In the human dimension, we're really good at the people that have the money or have the loudest voice, and we're really good at asking some but excluding others. So, for example, the voices that are loud in this are hunters who just want, I shouldn't say just, but hunters who want more opportunities to hunt, and farmers who are concerned about the cranes eating the seeds in the spring in their crops. Voices that we don't often listen to would be the indigenous voices. So, for example, there's the Ojibwe that live in Wisconsin, and the Ho-Chunk and some of the other nations that are indigenous to Wisconsin have an affinity to cranes. The Ojibwe have a entire clan that's built off of the cranes in their culture. So, what is that implication for that group of people if we were to institute a hunt? The other thing that we don't do really well at is considering the non-human voices. So in this case, it would be looking at the crane biology, and I would say, if you're a conservation specialist out there, like, you are the voice of these non-human entities within a landscape. You're the one that has the information that can convey this important information about whatever the issue is. So in this case, with the crane biology, is really important to check out. Like, what about cranes would say, yeah, this is they could sustain a hunt, or no, they couldn't. when we look at the biology, they have very limited population growth. So for example, they live like 50 years, and so they don't become into sexual maturity till later in their life. And then at that, they only have one surviving chick a year. And they usually have two, and only one usually survives. So that's an important part of their biology that we need to understand. So if they are decimated, they do not rebound quickly. We needed to consider what is their role in the ecosystems, seed dispersal, wetland health, things like that. Like, what is their actual role, and what would the impact happen? What would the impact be if they were not on the landscape? We need to consider what current best management practices are. So, for example, farmers are not liking that cranes eat their seed, but best management practices say don't. Cranes eating seed in the spring, it doesn't help to shoot them in the fall, right? It's the best practices are to deal with it in the source and the time and the place that it's happening versus a hunt in the fall. So that wouldn't help, I guess, is what I'm saying. Things like the whooping crane. The whooping crane is an endangered species. There's not very many left in the world. They look remarkably similar to a crane. So when there is a hunt every year, it seems like there's one that's killed because somebody thinks it's, whatever. But they look remarkably similar to a sandtail crane. And so invariably, if we open a hunt, we are putting that species at risk as well. And then, so we're asking all the stakeholders, we're like listening to all the voices and getting the big picture. And then I think we ask, would the hunt contribute to the health of the biotic community? And if our answer is no, we can look for identify alternatives. Like, for example, we could do compensation for farmers, or we can provide other deterrents that would be helpful, like getting rid of if there's certain species, there's certain individual birds that are a problem, maybe getting rid of those or relocating them, or using, there's chemicals that are taste deterrents, things like that. For hunters, the two voices that are really pushing for the crane hunt is maybe just more training on conservation. I was just talking to the man, his name is Sinisa, and he's from Serbia, and he translated the Sand Colony Almanac into Serbian, and he said in his country, in order to be a hunter, you have to go through like 12 classes, 12 full-day classes. To get your hunting certification, and he teaches one on conservation. So part of the hunter licensing process involves a bigger understanding of ecological awareness. So as an example of an alternative is how can we help hunters see a bigger picture to help that voice be met, right? And then ultimately make a decision. And then once that decision is made, track. Did it really preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, or did it harm it? And then reflect upon that. So with that, I will end. Here's just a couple things if people are interested, and I think Megan's going to also put out some links possibly to the group at some point, but here's if you want to learn more about the Leopold Foundation and some of the work we do. I know we're running short on time, so I will pause here and be available for questions. Sorry, it's always a lot to get through.
Absolutely, and it was, this has just been a really great hour, and yeah, I think it's been informative and inspiring. I know the foundation focuses on storytelling as a means of engaging people and it's, inspiring action, and I think this was a really fantastic example of that. So thank you so much for sharing that story. And yeah, we'll definitely look forward to future discussions. We are a little over time, and we actually don't have any questions in the Q&A. I think that folks were just letting the story flow over them. So yeah, I've put the link to the foundation in the chat if folks want to click on that directly. I'm sure that from there they can make additional connections and follow up if they do have questions that they'd like to get in touch with you on.
Yeah, and I'll just tag, because I know you have a lot of conservation professionals and in forestry specifically. The link on the last screen is mywisconsinwoods.org. You can find it through our foundation as well. But we work partner with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, working with private landowners to help them come up with plans for their woodland lots. And so that might be something, there's a lot of resources within that you might be interested in. We have monthly programming that also you might be interested in. They're free virtual programs. So that's something else you might be interested in that you could access anywhere. So just as a couple ways to connect.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, thank you again so much for your time and for
Absolutely.
a really fantastic presentation. We really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you.
Gary?
I enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Yeah, Gary, any last comments?
Simply to thank Jennifer. I want to follow up with you. Thank you for the very thought-provoking and very well-informed presentation. And you really hit the nail on the head with the
Okay.
land ethic. Thank you very much for the time you spent on that issue. I really appreciate it. I think it'll be really useful to our audience in the months ahead. I look
All
forward
right.
to working with you in the coming year. Hope you have a very good Thanksgiving holiday. Let me
And
say
you as well.
goodbye
Thank you.
and ask all of you to tune in again next month for another edition of Framing the Future, which we examine the issues that'll frame the future of forestry in Maryland and other jurisdictions around the country. Thank you for joining us today.